Hey guys, welcome back to today's video. Today is Saturday, September 21st, 2024, and today we are going to be talking about a brand new poll from the University of New Hampshire showing that Kamala Harris holds an 11-point advantage in this battleground state. New Hampshire, a state that President Biden won in 2020, that Hillary Clinton won in 2016 by just a few thousand votes, actually. About 1,000 votes separated the two candidates. In the 2016 election, what was the narrowest race of that election cycle that came really down to the wire. Now, the University of New Hampshire poll is notable for a variety of different reasons. For one, they did a poll that was conducted all the way back in August in the immediate aftermath of the VP announcement, showing Kamala Harris with just a 5-point advantage over former President Trump. Today, that advantage has increased to 11 points statewide in a 6-point shift in just over a month. On top of that, too, this poll was conducted entirely post-presidential debate. And one thing is clear, Kamala Harris is gaining support since that debate in a way that we have seen not only in New Hampshire, but across the United States. Beyond that point, too, the reason this is significant is because New Hampshire is a state that President Biden won back in 2020 by just roughly 7 points. So any type of shift in favor of the Democratic Party does show that potentially in some other battleground states, we could be in for similar shifts that ultimately result in Kamala Harris winning the presidential election by potentially a larger margin than that of President Joe Biden back in 2020. And so I wanted us to unpack a few things related to this poll, but none more important than the overall lead that Kamala Harris displays with 54% of the projected vote in this election in New Hampshire based on this new poll. We've seen New Hampshire polled for a variety of different times across battleground districts, across battleground states, battleground districts, and also the battleground governor's race in this state, but the presidential race is what I am really most focused on. And so they actually did a poll, like I said, back in August that showed Kamala Harris with roughly a 5-point lead here, a 7-point lead in the multi-way race with RFK Jr. in the race. Now that he's no longer there, it's a two-way race. But their two-way polls did show that Kamala Harris maintained this 5-point advantage. It is important to note that it is a massive turnaround here, that it's going from Kamala Harris plus 5 to Kamala Harris plus 11. This really goes to show that there is a significant improvement here that cannot be ignored, and one that actually seems to be in line with what some other of the battleground states are telling us since this presidential debate. And going back to 2020, we saw that the last poll that was conducted by the University of New Hampshire in the month of October, right before the presidential election, November 3rd, 2020, was when we had the presidential election. Kamala Harris was on the ballot with Joe Biden when he was up 8 points against Donald Trump. He ended up winning by 7.2. The University of New Hampshire ended up being one of the most accurate pollsters in the state. St. Anselm also had Biden up 8 points, which in their most recent data point isn't as strong for Kamala Harris, but shows her up by 8 points, another improvement off the 2020 margin. But point being here, the University of New Hampshire had Biden up by 8. Today, they have Harris up by 11. And they really come in to show this here, that there's near unanimous support for Harris amongst New Hampshire Democrats, something that Democrats didn't see back in the day and age that Joe Biden was the Democratic nominee for president here. And it really has a lot of different points that really explain why Kamala Harris is starting to do better, whether it's favorabilities, whether it's the perception on her, whether it's a unified Democratic Party or swayed independent base. All of this together is the reason why Kamala Harris is leading in New Hampshire by a significant amount. And looking back at the 2020 data, I understand and see this to be something that Kamala Harris is expanding on Joe Biden's lead. And the St. Anselm poll confirms it, and so does the University of New Hampshire poll as well. And even looking back at 2022, we actually saw that the polls were a lot tighter then, far underestimating the Democratic Party in this battleground state. Maggie Hassan, the Democratic senator, was running for re-election and led on Election Day by an average of 1.4%. The polls had indicated that New Hampshire was going to be remarkably close, that Don Bolduc, who was endorsed by Donald Trump and the Republican nominee for Senate here, was going to come within a very narrow amount in order to potentially win the Senate race in the state of New Hampshire. But here's what happened. Not only did Democrats win it, they won it by nearly 10 points. Maggie Hassan won by 9.1%, and the University of New Hampshire poll underestimated the Democratic Party's actual margin by 7.1%. St. Anselm College, the one that shows Kamala Harris up 8 points, underestimated Democrats by 10.1%. The fact is, in 2022, the polls were quite wrong in New Hampshire. They overestimated the Republican Party tremendously. Again, on average, the incorrect margin here, an overestimation for Republicans, comes down to just under 8 percentage points. That's massive when you're looking at a presidential election, but something that might be able to be explained by the 2022 year that was very much different than what we were expecting based on what the polls were saying because of Roe versus Wade. But now that we're in a day and age, a presidential election, and the first election since the overturning of Roe v. Wade, New Hampshire seems to be doing even better for Kamala Harris. And in terms of what we've been seeing in recent moves, Nikki Haley's Iowa campaign co-chair just endorsed Kamala Harris. Now, Iowa actually had a stunning new poll for Kamala Harris that showed her within 4 points in this state. It's a state that Trump won by 9 in 2016, 8 in 2020. And so for the margin here, this was the best pollster in the state that has gotten it right every election since the 2008 Democratic primary, or caucus, gotten it right, correctly chose Obama in that primary, chose Obama in the general election, chose Obama again in 2012, chose Trump by a massive margin in 2016, chose Trump by a similar margin in 2020, same thing happened, chose Chuck Grassley by the exact percent that he won by in the Senate race in 2022, now saying that in Iowa, Donald Trump is up just 4 points, and it actually makes sense too. When you have people like Nikki Haley's Iowa campaign co-chair, the person that was meant to get her to second place in the state of Iowa, who invested, a long time of their life investing their time into a Republican candidate for president, now endorsing Kamala Harris, not just saying don't vote for Trump, but actively endorsing the Democratic nominee for president here, we are seeing something change amongst Republicans here ever since it's been the aftermath of January 6th, ever since the aftermath of COVID-19. All of these different points here that Republicans have come to understand is a negative for Donald Trump. Some Republicans said, this is too much for me. And whether it's Nikki Haley's Iowa campaign co-chair or the only other Republican vice president besides Mike Pence in the 21st century saying he is voting for Kamala Harris. Mike Pence not even endorsing Donald Trump. It is clear as day that there are Republicans out there that voted for him twice that will not vote for him in this election cycle. And New Hampshire is one of those states where we saw a significant number of support for Nikki Haley that is likely leading to Kamala Harris with this 11-point advantage in this otherwise battleground state. And the impact of it on the down-ballot races seems to be tremendous as well. Chris Pappas is in a battleground district in New Hampshire's first, has New Hampshire Democrats up by 17. In the second district that is meant to be more competitive, meant to be potentially a Republican flip, Democrats are up by 11. And the governor's race, where we've actually seen some strong polling data here for Republicans, Annie Craig, the Democratic nominee here, is defeating the former Republican Senator Kelly Ayotte by 1 point in this race. The Republicans routinely were up on. Now with Kamala Harris being up by so much, she's dragging the other Democrats across the finish line. And in terms of what this actually would look like on an electoral map, given an 11-point swing, we would be in for a pretty substantial Democratic victory. If we were to just, compare the states that voted the way they did back in 2020 and just go ahead and shift all of them by a margin of 4 points, what you would result in is a map that looked very similar to this. An 11-point victory would mean states like Pennsylvania become likely blue. States like Michigan become likely blue. Wisconsin, lean blue. Minnesota, likely blue, right? Colorado becomes safe. New Mexico, likely. Nevada, likely. Virginia, likely, right? Margins here, winning in North Carolina, winning in the state of Georgia. These would be massive margins here for the Democratic Party, and what it would result in is a map that looks like this. 319 electoral votes for Kamala Harris to Donald Trump's 0 right now. If we can actually just characterize it, actually, I'm wrong about this. If Florida was to shift by 4 points as well, Florida would be a tilt Democratic state. And so this is what the map would likely look like. I'm not going to spend too much time characterizing the safer or less safe Republican states. Not too much to focus on here, but it would look like this. Iowa becomes lean. Ohio becomes lean. Nebraska at large. Nebraska's first goes there. Mississippi becomes likely. Montana becomes likely. Alaska likely. South Carolina likely. Overall, though, this is the map that we'd be looking at. It would be pretty substantial, I would say, for Kamala Harris. 349 electoral votes, assuming that this New Hampshire map ends up being something that is correct. Now, obviously, I think New Hampshire might be acting very much independently than that of other states. I remember that when it was Biden versus Trump, New Hampshire was a state that really held out in favor of Joe Biden, despite some of the other national polls and some of the other statewide polls showing Donald Trump in the advantage. But I think that's also because New Hampshire has really been engrossed in the general election season for quite some time. I mean, they have been reverting to their priors ever since the Democratic and Republican primaries. Why? Because both parties were campaigning pretty heavily in this state, which meant that these voters were at the forefront of the general election season very early on. And now that Kamala Harris's approval rating now rebounds into being in the favor for the first time ever in 3.5 years, very, very substantial here for the Democratic Party, New Hampshire looks a lot more likely to go to Kamala Harris, and so do many other battleground states. But this is one of those early warning signs that really shows us if New Hampshire is shifting by 4, chances are so many other battleground states are following suit. And again, you can likely see that in the 2024 data. You can see that in some of these battleground states, some of the polls here are showing better numbers for Kamala Harris than they showed for Joe Biden. For instance, in some of the recent data points here, Kamala Harris being up 2 by insider advantage, which is routinely a Republican pollster, that matters for Kamala Harris. When you're taking a look at states like Pennsylvania, where Kamala Harris in some of these recent polls up, according to Quinnipiac, by 5, it was 6 in the other poll. You see in the New York Times up by 4, USA Today, Harris up by 3. These are all outperformances than the margin that Joe Biden had back in 2020. You can look at North Carolina. Kamala Harris being up by 1 in Emerson, that's a victory that Joe Biden did not have. Quinnipiac having her up by 3, that's a victory that Joe Biden simply did not have. You can start to see that in many of these states, Kamala Harris is outperforming the margin for Donald Trump. And sure, she isn't doing as well in Georgia or Arizona, but ultimately, what we are finding across the scale is that Kamala Harris is making improvements. And based on the 538 forecast, North Carolina, tied neck and neck with Donald Trump. Pennsylvania, 58% chance for Kamala Harris. Wisconsin, 61%. And Michigan, 64%. Georgia, Donald Trump at the advantage narrowly. Arizona, tied. Nevada, Kamala Harris up. When it comes down to the state of New Hampshire, in terms of the electoral margin here, 538 hasn't reflected this recent poll as much. It is showing a slight increase for Kamala Harris's support, but they roughly expect her to get roughly even with that of the 2020 election, which again is not the worst news for the Democratic Party. 2020, after all, they did win. But I do think that the University of New Hampshire, as one of the more accurate pollsters back in 2020, if not the most accurate pollster of the 2020 election in the state of New Hampshire, it is telling us that there is some levels of shifting happening, maybe particularly amongst white voters, as we see in New Hampshire, the second whitest state in the country, a state with a large swath of white voters in the battleground electorate. I mean, this is where you start to see Kamala Harris and the Democratic Party at large really starting to counteract some of the bleeding they have seen amongst minority voters in battleground states on the national level. We saw it happen in 2020. We will likely see it happen again in 2024, but this may be an indicator that seems to be in line with what we're seeing in decisions like Nikki Haley's Iowa campaign co-chair. Someone who has been very much a part of Republican politics for quite some time, who is now publicly endorsing Kamala Harris. And you can see, too, when it comes down to Polymark and what the expectations are, they have risen for Kamala Harris since the presidential debate. Ever since that debate, you can see on the graph that on the day of the debate, Kamala Harris was losing to Donald Trump at a 46% chance of winning the presidency. Today, she's at 51%. That's up from where she was before, and it puts her in the advantage, whereas Donald Trump previously was also in the advantage. And when it comes down to some of these battleground states, you can see that over time, Wisconsin has gotten bluer. Michigan has gotten bluer. Pennsylvania has gotten bluer. North Carolina has gotten bluer. Georgia as well, Arizona as well, Nevada as well. I mean, we've seen improvements at large here for Kamala Harris in a way that is quite monumental for the vice president. And again, New Hampshire is an indicator of how some of the other states might be going as well. And it does show that Kamala Harris is on track to just expand in some of these battleground states, especially in states like New Hampshire, where you could be seeing that larger portions of the white electorate might be driving Kamala Harris's margins. Suburban voters in particular, rural voters in particular, that might be warming up to the idea of a Vice President Kamala Harris as President of the United States. And even if it doesn't necessarily translate to election victories in some of these more rural and suburban counties, losing better is always better for the Democratic Party. Losing by 30 instead of 40 when you lost by 40 in 2020 is a surefire sign that you're going to win the state again in 2024. And so I think that's what Democrats are really focused on and really trying to do in this election. And so I'd keep an eye out on New Hampshire as a state that has been really engrossed in this general election season since January of this year. Has been a state that, held out pretty strong for Joe Biden, just as again we saw, particularly amongst white voters. But we have now seen in just under a month, Kamala Harris make a 6-point improvement across the state of New Hampshire by the same pollster, same methodology, same type of approach to the election process. And what they are finding is what Kamala Harris was up by 5 before, today she leads by 11. A lead that we can also see in some of these other battleground states have gone from Donald Trump being in the advantage to now Kamala Harris leading, something that I think the Democratic Party will look at and say, at this point, the debate seems to be that turning point in favor of the Democratic Party. Enough so that gives them the advantage in some states that, again, they previously weren't leading in. New Hampshire is not one of those states, but it does tell a story that I think we are going to be looking at and possibly seeing displayed across many other battleground states over the coming months as we get more polls and more data and more points to come to understand the current state of the race, with New Hampshire really being at the forefront of it in this video. And so I'd leave you with this. The New Hampshire poll isn't something that means that this election is at all wraps. A 4-point improvement for Kamala Harris on the broad strokes level would mean that she easily wins this election. But that's not where we're at. New Hampshire has a unique portion of the electorate that doesn't seem to be as pushed away from the Democratic Party as some other voters might feel or seem to be in polling data, in actuality, whatever it might be. But ultimately, this poll is strong for Kamala Harris, and it does go to show that in the states that might also be sleepers, in states that Democrats aren't investing as much time or effort in, like a state like New Hampshire, because they are focused primarily on those 7 other battleground states, voters still here positively respond to Kamala Harris's candidacy and very clearly want her to be the next president of the United States. This 11-point lead means far more than just a New Hampshire, headline here out of this battleground state. It means a lot for many of the others in a way that I think Democrats are going to look at and say, this is very positive for us. A 4-point improvement in one battleground state likely means an improvement everywhere else. So thank you guys so much for watching this video. Make sure to comment down suggestions below. Subscribe on the left if you haven't already, and check out the Instagram and Twitter. At the top left of the screen, there's also a Discord server for you to go ahead and join. On the screen, there's a video you can watch, and then a playlist for my 2024 presidential election analysis videos. Again, thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see you all later today.